On Holy Saturday the world held its breath. The clamor of Good Friday had faded, and the light of Easter had not yet broken through. It was a day suspended in stillness, a pause between agony and triumph. The churches were dim and hushed, their altars stripped and silent. No incense rose, no hymns echoed through the stone arches. The tabernacle stood open and empty, the flame of the sanctuary lamp extinguished. It was the only day in the liturgical year when the church did not offer the Mass, and yet within that void something stirred. Padre Pio sensed it. In his small monastic cell, he moved with unusual slowness. He did not speak much. His hands clutched his rosary, his eyes fixed long on the crucifix that hung above his desk. Others around him noted the change. He was not weakened in body, but withdrawn into something deep. A holy weight seemed to have descended on him. It was not grief, nor expectation. It was something more solemn. He had always known that this day was misunderstood, reduced to preparation for Easter feasting, or overlooked as a mere pause. But for him, Holy Saturday was a battlefield shrouded in silence. In the silence, demons moved. Padre Pio once wrote that it was during this time that hell worked hardest, sensing the coming defeat. On Holy Saturday, while Christ descended into the depths of death, the enemy roamed more freely, hunting for those who had let down their guard. The faithful, weary from Good Friday's emotion, often fell into distraction. But Padre Pio remained vigilant. He knew the quiet was not empty, it was filled with unseen struggle. The veil between heaven and hell thinned, and those who prayed could feel it. The Capuchin friary where he lived echoed with an eerie stillness. Even the birds outside the stone walls seemed quieter. The monks kept their hours, but with subdued voices, as if not to disturb something sacred. Padre Pio spent much of the day in his cell or knelt before the darkened tabernacle. He did not wait for Easter. He endured Holy Saturday. The sense of suspension was heavy, but he embraced it fully. To him, this was not a day of waiting, but of spiritual confrontation. There was an old tradition, rarely practiced, of praying a specific prayer only on Holy Saturday. It was a prayer of dissent, of trust in the hidden work of God, of surrender in silence. It was not widely known, and even fewer remembered its words. But those who did said it opened the heart to things too deep for language. Padre Pio did not speak it aloud. He simply let it rise within him, woven into his breathing and heartbeat. That prayer, whispered in the stillness between death and resurrection, had become his sword. As the hours passed and the candles in the chapel burned low, a strange peace settled over him. Not the joy of victory, but the sacred assurance that, even in silence, God acted. The body of Christ lay in the tomb, but the soul of the Church trembled in anticipation. For those who truly entered into the stillness, the silence was not absence, it was preparation. Padre Pio remained there unmoved, sensing that the deepest mysteries did not scream, they whispered. Holy Saturday was not forgotten, it was feared even by the darkness, and that, he knew, was exactly why the faithful could not afford to ignore it. In a cloistered corner of the Carmelite convent in Coimbra, Sister Lucia moved through the stone corridors with a quiet gravity. Her eyes, shielded behind simple glasses, carried the weight of decades. Though the world had long since turned its gaze to other visions, she still bore within her the fire of Fatima. But there were things she had never written, words she had never spoken publicly, not because of fear, but because of timing. Certain truths, she believed, were only meant to be passed on in silence, and only to those who were prepared to understand. It was during the late hours of a holy Saturday, many years before, that she had confided in a visiting priest. The chapel was empty, lit by a single flame. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the stone walls, and within that hush, she spoke a sentence that had never left him. It was not a prophecy in the dramatic sense, not a vision or a command from heaven. It was a warning, a sacred intuition. A prayer, she had said, had been entrusted to her. One not found in books, one not recited in common devotion. A prayer, given not to be proclaimed, but to be protected. This prayer, she explained in her gentle voice, was linked to Holy Saturday, not just as a ritual, but as a key that opened the soul to the hidden workings of grace in the silence between death and resurrection. It was a plea not only for Christ to rise, but for the soul to remain faithful in the grave of waiting. It asked for light, not in moments of victory, but in the long nights when nothing seemed to move. She did not write it down. She only whispered it once, and the priest, trembling, understood it was not his to repeat. Years later, that same priest found his way to San Giovanni Rotondo. Drawn by whispers, pulled by the weight of what he had heard, he requested to speak with Padre Pio. When the moment finally came, he did not explain everything. He only spoke of a prayer, a silence, and Sister Lucia. Padre Pio said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and bowed his head, as if confirming what he already knew. The atmosphere in the room shifted, thickened, like the unseen presence of something holy. And though no further words passed between them on the matter, the priest left knowing that what had been entrusted was already known. This prayer, this sacred fragment, began to reappear in patterns. Padre Pio's unusual behavior on Holy Saturday, his extended time in prayer, the look in his eyes when asked about the days of silence. Those close to him noticed how his demeanor shifted as the Triduum reached its second day. He did not speak of Lucia, but something in his soul responded to a voice few had heard. It was as if somewhere in the spirit their paths had crossed again, converging not through letters or meetings, but through obedience to something neither of them dared disturb. The mystery of the prayer remained veiled, but its effects, subtle and precise, unfolded in those who had received it. It called the faithful not to performance, but to depth, not to declarations, but to surrender. And through Sister Lucia's whisper and Padre Pio's silence, it endured, unwritten, unspoken, yet unmistakably alive. Hidden not to be forgotten, but to be guarded until the time was right. For those who listened closely on Holy Saturday, in the stillness of the church and the quiet of the soul, it could still be heard, not as a voice but as a presence, a secret that traveled only by whisper. In the spring of 1998, a quiet monastery nestled in the Italian countryside experienced a series of disturbances that no one could quite explain. It began subtly. Candles refused to stay lit during prayer. The chapel grew inexplicably cold, even when the weather outside was warm. Sisters began waking at the same hour every night, just before 3 in the morning, with a sense of dread they could not name. At first, these events were dismissed as coincidence, the imagination of tired minds during the rigor of Holy Week. But as Holy Saturday approached, the unease became palpable. Something unseen pressed against the silence of the convent, not loud but heavy, like a presence waiting for something. The Mother Superior, an elderly nun who had served in the convent for over 4 decades, began searching the archives. She remembered hearing long ago of an old tradition, one rarely spoken of and nearly forgotten, a prayer tied to Holy Saturday. Not the common liturgical prayers, but something more intimate and mysterious. It was said to shield the soul during the most vulnerable moment of the Triduum, the day when Christ lay in the tomb and the church seemed breathless. What she found was a handwritten letter, aged and faded, folded within the pages of a devotional book. The seal was broken, the ink fragile. It referenced a priest who had once spoken with both Sister Lucia and Padre Pio. The letter contained no full text of the prayer but described its importance. It warned that when the faithful neglected the silence of Holy Saturday, when the soul no longer made space for mourning and waiting, the enemy found room to enter. It explained that the power of the resurrection begins not with joy but with reverent stillness. And if the church forgot to keep watch during that stillness, darkness would creep in through the cracks of inattention. The nun's hands trembled as she read. It was already Holy Saturday morning. The Mass of the Vigil was only hours away. She realized they had not prepared the chapel. The prayer, the silence, the vigil, they had all been consumed by routine. That night, as the vigil began, several candles again extinguished themselves, just as the Exultet was proclaimed. A novice fainted during the reading of Genesis. The choir's harmony fell into dissonance during the Gloria. These were small signs, but to those who knew, they echoed something deeper. The old nun sat in the back pew, clutching the letter. She whispered what little she could remember of the prayer under her breath, not as a formality, but as a desperate act of protection. But it felt like trying to shut a door already opened. The silence they had not kept had already been filled. Elsewhere, stories began to surface. A family that had always prayed together on Holy Saturday skipped the tradition for the first time in years. That night, their home was disturbed by what they later described as an oppressive force. In another town, a parish forgot to light the Paschal candle properly. No one noticed until the next morning when the flame refused to catch. Small things, scattered across distant places, all pointing to a quiet pattern. A forgotten moment had weakened the shield. The church had celebrated death and longed for resurrection, but it had not guarded the in-between. For those who had once known the prayer, the realization came like a weight. It had not been meant for fame or widespread liturgical use. It was meant to protect the soul in the one moment when Christ was hidden and the world was most spiritually vulnerable. And now, that protection had been neglected. The warning had come. But for many it came too late. The silence had already been filled by noise, and once something else takes root in sacred emptiness, it does not leave easily. The prayer was never meant to be recited casually. It was not designed for group liturgies, nor was it printed in books or shared in public devotions. It had no name, no formal structure, no title to distinguish it. It was simply known as the Prayer of the Silence, and those who had received It understood that its power did not lie in the words alone, but in the way it was spoken and the condition of the soul when it was offered. According to what was passed down through whispers and letters, there were 3 essential conditions without which the prayer would remain ineffective, almost as if its spiritual key would not turn unless all 3 locks were aligned. The first condition was absolute silence, not merely the absence of noise, but a deliberate stillness of the heart. The one who prayed had to withdraw from distraction, from inner chatter, from the constant pull of worry and anticipation. The silence required was not external alone. It was a submission of the soul to the stillness Christ himself entered on. Holy Saturday. Those who tried to rush into the prayer with hurried hearts found nothing. The silence had to be accepted like a desert, empty, bare, yet full of presence. It was in this stillness that the soul could begin to hear what God was doing behind the veil. The second condition was light, not the bright, artificial glow of electricity, but the gentle flicker of a single flame. A candle, lit intentionally, was to be placed before the one praying. The light represented hope in the tomb, the small but unwavering truth that even in death, God was still at work. It was not just symbolic, it was spiritual. The flickering of the flame served as a sign of life hidden beneath the surface. Those who prayed in darkness, without light, missed the essential element of the mystery, that God does not abandon, even in silence. The candle stood as witness, a companion in the waiting. The third condition was solitude. The prayer could not be shared. It could not be prayed in the presence of others. It had to be spoken in private, with no eyes to see, no ears to hear. It was a communion between the soul and the crucified Christ, now hidden in the tomb. This solitude was not meant to isolate but to unite. It placed the soul in alignment with Christ's descent into death, when even the apostles had fled and the women watched from afar. Only in solitude could the vulnerability of the prayer be fully embraced. To be alone was to mirror the loneliness of Holy Saturday, the space where even heaven seemed to go quiet. Those who followed these 3 conditions often described an experience unlike any other. It was not marked by visions or ecstasy, but by clarity. A deep sense of being seen, even in the silence. A warmth that arose not from emotion, but from presence. The prayer itself was brief, sometimes changing from person to person. It was not rigid. What mattered was not the words, but the alignment of the soul. If silence, light, and solitude were honored, the soul opened itself to something ancient, something that moved beneath time and echoed the descent of Christ into the depths. Padre Pio was said to observe these 3 conditions meticulously. Those close to him noticed how he would disappear for hours on Holy Saturday, never explaining where he went or what he was doing. But the candle always burned in his cell, and he would emerge changed, quieter, steadier, as if he had touched something too sacred for speech. The same was said of Sister Lucia, who would spend the entire day in her cell with a single candle lit and her breviary closed. She would pray not from the page, but from memory, and only after hours of complete silence. The prayer was not a solution. It was a surrender. It did not fix the world's chaos, but allowed the soul to remain unshaken within it. And though many had forgotten it, those who remembered knew, without silence, without light, Without solitude, the tomb remained only death. But with them, it became the threshold of something holy. The three conditions were not burdens. They were the key to hearing the whisper of resurrection before the stone was ever rolled away. In the years following Padre Pio's death and Sister Lucia's fading presence from public view, the memory of the prayer began to dissolve. Few spoke of it. Fewer still remembered it clearly. Holy Saturday became a day of liturgical pause rather than spiritual warfare, a forgotten space between the agony of the cross and the joy of the resurrection. Churches fell into habit. Devotions grew louder, not deeper. But the world began to change in ways that stirred something old from its slumber. A spiritual fatigue spread like a shadow. Homes no longer felt safe, hearts grew restless even in prayer, and moments once marked by grace felt disturbingly hollow. It was in the middle of this silence, this hidden ache, that small remnants began to resurface. A letter found in a box of forgotten belongings, a journal entry from a nun written in faded ink, an old recording of a priest referencing the prayer in the tomb. None of these revealed the words themselves, but all pointed in the same direction. They spoke of the day when heaven does not speak but watches, when the veil thins not with triumph but with testing. The day when Christ lay in death and the faithful stood with nothing but trust. The rediscovery did not begin with the church as a whole. It began in households, in bedrooms turned into makeshift chapels, in young believers who sensed that their noisy spirituality lacked something essential. Some began to light a candle on Holy Saturday and sit in silence, not because they were told to, but because they were drawn to it. Others, without knowing the tradition, instinctively withdrew into solitude on that day. The spirit of the prayer, like a wind through dry leaves, was moving again, not loudly but with weight. A spiritual shield was being rebuilt from fragments. In monasteries and small chapels across the world, older priests began to speak again. They remembered how Padre Pio would vanish on that day. They recalled stories of Sister Lucia's whispered warnings. What had once seemed like private devotion now appeared prophetic. The silence of Holy Saturday was not just a pause, it was a defense, a moment of alignment, and the world, desperate for deeper meaning, had unknowingly walked away from it, but the shield was not lost. It had only been buried under distraction and noise. Now, slowly, it returned. A parish in Poland began hosting Holy Saturday vigils in total silence, with only candlelight. A Carmelite monastery in South America rediscovered the practice and began training its novices in the three conditions. Online, believers began to share testimonies, not dramatic, but piercing. Peace returning to homes, nightmares ending, the sense of being watched fading. Not because of loud deliverance, but because silence had been restored. No institution claimed ownership of the movement. It did not become a program or a campaign. It was passed heart to heart, household to household. Each person who reclaimed the silence helped mend the shield, and those who entered into the prayer, who embraced the stillness, the solitude, the light, found something profound. Not visions or revelations, but restoration. A grounding that made them unshakable. A presence in the absence. A whisper in the tomb that said, "He is not here, but you are, and that is enough." The forgotten shield, once whispered from Lucia to a priest and confirmed in silence by Padre Pio, had never died. It had only waited for a time when the world would realize how much it needed what it had ignored. And now, in small circles and sacred corners, it returned, not as a roar, but as a vow. The vow of those who would never let Holy Saturday pass again without silence, without flame, without prayer.